Richard, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, you're the Telegraph's Agony uncle. Tell us how you fell into that role.
Well, it's the first time that I've been a newspaper agony aunt, agony uncle, however you want to phrase it. But actually, I think one of the reasons that I was quite keen to do it when Graham Norton left, because Graham did it for quite a few years, and then he left and they offered it to me, was because I realised that I'd sort of done quite a lot of that kind of thing on This Morning, when Judy and I presented This Morning. You know, we used to do a phone-in every day. I think they still do a phone-in every day. But we had an agony aunt, Denise Robertson, who was a wonderful woman from Sunderland, from the northeast. And, you know, we did This Morning for 13, 14 years. And that's an agony phone-in on a huge range of subjects. You know, it could be anything. It could be sex, it could be money, it could be relationships of some kind, it could be work problem. I mean, you know, you name it, the whole kind of gamut of what an agony page is full of. And we did it for 13 years, pretty much every week. And I suppose, imbibed a degree of, I think wisdom is too self-aggrandizing a word to use, but certainly experience in analysing other people's problems. And I found I quite enjoyed it. And I've always enjoyed reading agony columns. And when Graham Norton was doing it in the Telegraph, unless there was a big news story on that Saturday morning, because he did it on Saturdays as I do, it was always the first page I turned to. It used to be on the back of the Saturday section. And unless, as I say, there was something I knew I had to read first, that would be the first thing I did. I'd go to the Saturday section and read his column, because it was funny and it was wise and it could be very, very dry in a witty sense. And I just loved it. And when I read that he'd gone, in fact, it was the week he left, he wrote a little sort of paragraph saying, "Well, guys, I've had a great time doing this for 5-6 years, whatever, but this is my last column." I was really, really fed up. You know, I knew I was going to miss it. And then literally 5 minutes later, the phone went and it was the Telegraph saying, "Would I like to do it?" And I said, "You absolutely," you know, in a heartbeat. And I took over.
Do you have a process? Like, do you have something that you like doing, breaking down a problem, or is there? Do you ever ask for advice on the advice that you're giving?
I tend not to do the latter. What I tend to do is look for the real message in the letter. Because in my experience, it's not always the case, but in my experience, a lot of the time, the real problem is buried. Not completely, it kind of pokes through the paragraphs here and there. But what people are really asking me, or what's really giving them the issue that they want me to help them deal with, they're almost in denial about. I mean, I had a typical letter this week. A guy who's married to a younger wife. They've got a couple of young children together. He's in his mid-50s, she's in her mid-30s. And the letter was ostensibly about a skiing trip, which she'd organised for them later this year. And he was saying to me that he'd wanted to appear enthusiastic for his wife because she was desperate to go on the skiing trip, but secretly he was dreading it. And he went on to list reasons which didn't really seem to add up. He said, I mean, I went skiing 25, 30 years ago with some young mates from uni, and it was a disaster, and I kept falling over, and I'm dreading that happening again. But that was his one and only skiing holiday. And he said, and I'm, you know, my wife wants us to have lessons in the morning and the kids to have kids' lessons, and then it's all to ski in the afternoon, and I don't think that will work. I was thinking, well, why? Why wouldn't that work? And then eventually out it came, what it was really about. It was his fear of getting older. He said, in the final paragraph, almost as a throwaway, he said, of course, I'm not as young as I was. And then, and this was the real giveaway, he said, and I'm worried that this will be the thin end of the wedge, and this will be the first older dad's activity that I can't do. So that was his problem. So my answer to him was very direct. I said, "You're not really worried about going skiing at all, are you? Because one, everybody falls over on their first skiing trip. So what happened 25 years ago is irrelevant. And two, what you're really worried about is getting older. And that's all in your head. You don't make any mention of not being fit or well or anything like that. So this is just you being frightened of making a bit of a fool of yourself and, you know, being caught out for being older. And you won't be. Loads of people start skiing in their mid-50s, in their 60s, and they learn to ski competently and confidently. So this is a problem that's purely in your head. Ignore it and go skiing." So that's an example of how I anyway, try and look for the real causal factor in why people have written to me.
That's so interesting. And I think when you first took on this role, you said that you wanted to be helping people, not to be judgmental. But do you think that sometimes you have to be a little bit judgmental, especially if the person is not necessarily the best behaved person in the scenario that they're describing? Maybe they're the source of their own unhappiness. Do you think that you have to be... What's that balance like?
I think you must never be cruel, and you must acknowledge that they've written to you because they're in need, you know, not necessarily in despair, but they're in need. But very often they're their own worst enemy. And it's a bit like being very honest with a friend. There's no point if a friend comes to you and lays out a problem in pussyfooting around if you think actually they're the problem and their attitude is actually what has to change rather than the world around them. So I will be quite blunt quite often in my column. And I think that actually is an old tradition of agony aunts, particularly, 50, 60, 70 years ago and at the turn of the century. They were very blunt with some of the people who wrote into them. I'm not as blunt as they might have been, like pull yourself together, young woman, and all this. But I will be straight. And I'll say, look, I'm sorry if you find this a little bit harsh, but what's the point of asking me for advice if I don't give it to you straight? And being honest with you, I think you're the one with the problem, and this is why, and this is how I think you can fix it. So yeah, quite often I don't throw the letter back in their faces, but I kind of confront them with actually their own prejudices, their own faults, their own weaknesses.
Yeah, bit of tough, constructive love.
Yes, it is. That's exactly what it is. It is.
Yeah.
It's constructive criticism. Absolutely.
Yeah. And what did you make of the more traditional agony aunts that Tanith Carey writes about in this week's Spectator? She traces it back all the way to the Victorian era, where agony aunts really kind of consolidated gender roles, we might say, effectively telling women to go back to the kitchen or not to go on a date with a boy or anything like that. I mean, quite an interesting route, I think, to this type of tradition.
I think that's a very interesting point. I've read the article, and she's absolutely right. That is what they did. They kind of reinforced social stereotypes. As you say, they reinforced the role of the little woman in the kitchen. I think there was one letter to a young woman who was concerned that she was, to use the word of the time, a frump. And the reason that she felt a frump was because she ate a lot of chocolates and all that kind of thing. These days, you probably get a reply which referred her to a therapist and a dietitian and all the rest of it. But back then, it was a very blunt, pull yourself together, stop eating chocolate. Otherwise, you'll never find a man. Yes. They were. I think they could be quite unreconstructed types. Those early agony aunts. They weren't any agony uncles in those days, as far as I'm aware. Reinforcing, as I say, social stereotypes at the time.
Well, just on that, Richard, you just mentioned that there weren't agony uncles at that time. As an agony uncle, do you feel a different approach to the role than a woman might have? Do you feel that you have to be perhaps less judgmental because you're a man?
It's a really good question. I think the area that I feel, I wouldn't say uncomfortable in, but I am probably more thoughtful and careful in my choice of language, is when I get a question or a problem about a sexual matter, something that's going wrong in the bedroom. And I think, I'm prepared to be shot down in flames for saying this, but I think that women agony aunts are probably better and more sensitive at dealing with those issues than a male agony uncle is, at least potentially. So I don't shy away from answering those letters, but I do acknowledge that my masculinity of a particular generation, because I'm in my mid-60s now, might come across as maybe a little inappropriate. So I'm I think very, very carefully about how I phrase the reply.
I don't think you can leave it at that, Richard. Go on, give us an example.
Well, it depends who the letter's from. If it's usually more often actually from a man. I don't get that many. I'm not a sex agony uncle, and I say that usually at the head of the replies to those letters. I say, look, I'm not a sex therapist. This is not my speciality. But you've asked me, and this is what I think. I tend to get more letters about it from men than I do from women. They seem more comfortable talking to me about it as a man. And again, we did a lot of sex phone-ins on this morning, an awful lot. Some of them were incredibly frank, considering it was daytime. It was going out at like 11:30 in the morning. I get fewer from women, but I get some. And it's almost always about their husbands. So I can deal with that because, I'm a husband, I'm a man. And although a lot of people don't accept this, men do talk to each other, actually, about sex issues. They're not these days all buttoned up. So, there is a dialogue out there to be accessed. But all I'm saying is that, and it's probably old-fashioned on me, but as a man, I just feel a little bit more potentially compromised. So I will answer the question as frankly as I can, but I tread very carefully.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Great pleasure. Nice talking to you.